I guess so. I'm a moderator of the board team. Should I get people in? See, as soon as available, I'll try like DVDs or
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to start sports journalism in the new era. Your moderator will be Jeff Baker with Seattle Times. So you're in the right session. We're looking for that. You're in the right session.
Still our employees, which is great. So now we've got our
Because you have to coordinate some Facebook ad spends and everything with it. But it's great to meet you. Let's stay in touch.
If you're here for the free pizza, that's up the way. No.
free DVDs. Yeah. It's on Prime.
It is on Prime.
You're welcome.
All right, everybody, welcome. Appreciate you showing up. My name's Jeff Baker. I'm a sports enterprise and investigative reporter for the Seattle Times. And if you can say that 10 times fast, you can actually have my job. I'll go on vacation. With me here to my right, to your left, is Brian Robinson. Brian runs a local real estate investment firm, but he is also the co-founder of first originally Sonics Central and now Sonics Rising, which is one of the better websites in the SB Nation fleet of nationwide websites. It's actually the only one that caters to a market that doesn't have an actual team, because it's Sonics Rising, and we're hoping to get that team back in Seattle at some point soon. But it consistently finishes in the top half of the websites that do have teams. So that's actually quite an accomplishment. And so he brings a different perspective from me. Obviously, I'm in the mainstream media. Brian's in the what would you call it? The alternative media?
I think it would be called emerging media.
Emerging media.
It was alternative when we started in 2004, and now I think it's established but alternative.
There are probably more alternative sites out there than mainstream sites. The way we're going, anyway. So that's going to be an interesting part of the discussion that we're going to have. I've known Brian for several years. And then with me to Brian's right is Devin Heinen, who is a regular contributor to the Atlantic magazine. For those of you who are familiar with that, Atlantic magazine. He's also been a contributor to Sports Illustrated. He's worked for ESPN.com, and Devin's an interesting case because he does a lot of long-form journalism. He does a lot of those pieces that take months to put together, and stuff that goes on for thousands of words. And I think there really is a real market emerging for that. We're going to talk about that right now. There's always been a market for it, but I think it's actually making a bit of a comeback these days in our world of 30-second sound bites or 10-second sound bites and quick little 40-character tweets. I think long form is making quite a comeback, so we're going to talk about a lot of that today. And then we'll have a little question and answer period. I know it's right before lunch, so I don't want to bore you guys too much, but we'll try to keep it lively and entertaining here. And I think one of the interesting things we can talk about today is just the state of media. It's kind of all over the map right now. I mean, you've got your mainstream sites, you've got your emerging sites, you've got sites that are sort of mainstream but trying to reinvent themselves as online only sites. And so there's this whole hodgepodge of media that's out there, and they're all fighting for the same thing, which is to get recognition and to keep recognition and to keep people subscribing and reading their content, and most importantly, to make money off of that content. Money's not a dirty word anymore in the media industry. It used to be. We used to think about journalism as just journalism, and the money side will let the ad people take care of that. It's not quite the same anymore. Nowadays, even journalists who are supposed to be, separate from the business side are being told to, look at stories, write their own headlines, do things that will engage more readers, that will create, let's put it clearly, clicks. You know, they want clicks. They want people who are going to subscribe and pay for that. And they're involving the journalists in it a lot more today. And so you see journalists getting more engaged on that front. And that creates its own set of issues, its own set of, ethical compromises at times. And I can say, speaking for myself at the Seattle Times, one of the things that we're constantly trying to do is find a way to engage readers, find a way to get more subscriptions for our newspaper so we can survive. But we're trying to do that in a way that we don't compromise the journalism, which can be two very, very different things. So I used to cover Major League Baseball for 16 years. And then 5 years ago, I left covering the Seattle Mariners, and I took up this sports enterprise and investigative job, which is sort of, again, all over the map. We're trying to figure out where it's going. Part of it was covering the emerging Seattle Arena story, which is now finally coming to a head years later. But we recognized at the Times about 5 years ago that people were going to be going for more long-form type of journalism. And long-form in newspapers means about 2,000 word stories, sometimes 3,000 word stories. We don't do the 5,000 to 10,000 words anymore. Very rarely do we do that. But we recognized that there was a need for that. And we found it interesting because all our surveys were showing this, even though they were also saying that people, younger generations, wanted to read tweets and wanted to look at videos, and don't make the videos too long or else you'll lose their interest. And yet, here we had this whole audience that wanted to read longer stories. So that was my job, was to go in and start doing more of those longer stories. And unfortunately, at times, the Seattle Times has run up against issues pertaining to that. It costs a lot of money to do long-form journalism well. And you maybe get one story out of it every month or so, if you're lucky. Whereas, we can go throw 3 Seahawks stories in the newspaper tomorrow, and they'll get an equivalent amount of clicks, of page views, of subscribers doing it. So there's always this tug of war going on about, particularly my job, what we want to do with it. Whether we want to keep devoting all these resources to, a minimal return, one good story every month getting great hits versus doing 15 stories that get, 3 times the hits. And so, we always find that we're battling against that over there. So I was wondering, Devin, when you're doing your kind of work, is it easier, do you think, to do it as a freelancer, to do it as a contributor for somebody who's paying you on the side versus doing it for a full-time employer who has to keep the bottom line going with the staff that they're paying a guaranteed fixed salary to?
Well, I would say my dream job is to work for the New York Times someday. I'm dying to move to New York and hopefully whenever I see a picture of just like the front-facing building of the New York Times and like Pointer's Columbia Journalism Review, I get like the shakes. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's the mecca of journalism. Then this is the Great Lady, that and the Washington Post, at least for newspapers. Nothing against Seattle Times. Love the Seattle Times, but but I find it's a mixed bag to be a freelancer. I started off at ESPN as a TV producer out of college, and then became the first person in company history to go from an entry-level production assistant job to a reporter for .com. And then for 2.5 years, I was a producer and going up the ranks that way. And as a reporter for .com, first doing the beat stuff, hockey during the lockout, lacrosse and stuff like that. But eventually they told me, hey, you need to get more reps, and we've already broken enough rules for you doing what you're doing now, so you need to leave, or you can be a producer. And I'm like, I don't want to do TV, I want to be a reporter. So I've been a freelancer for the past 4 years. Before that, I was at ESPN. This mixed bag because it's hard to get your name out to the right editors and get their attention and to keep their attention. It was kind of funny because in social media age, you might have a chance of striking it rich right from the start and get everybody's attention and everything, but you almost got to sell yourself. It takes a lot of relationship building. So it's a mixed bag. I don't have to answer that question.
No, it's definitely a mixed bag, and I'm sure you just said you don't necessarily have the full weight of the media organization behind you now with what you're doing. So how do you leverage your brand? I mean, can you use Twitter to do that? Can you use Facebook?
I am surgically attached to my phone and Twitter specifically. I check it way too often around the clock. But you know, I use that, and then once I've developed a good relationship with an editor and an outlet, and I start writing for them repeatedly, they will start putting their institutional resources behind me a little bit more with, like, you know, whether it's social or, you know, maybe promoting the story higher up on their site, or, you know, if it's a print piece, something like that, you get a little bit more institutional help that way.
So Brian, you had to start a website from basically scratch and build it from the ground up, and Twitter was just getting off the ground back in those days too. So how were you able to you know, leverage your site into the kind of readership that made it successful?
I think that we were kind of on the cutting edge of things. So we were really lucky. The Sonics, I was one of the very first people to get full practice access and media credentials as an internet-only member back in 2002. And between 2002 and 2004, we built up the brand. We were probably the second most popular, or most successful basketball-related website online back then, behind Clutch City Net. We were doing about 1.2 million independent views a month, which was really substantial for the time. It's still substantial today. And then we obviously lost the team, and we had a political bent that gave us a lot of attention. We launched the movie Sonicsgate, which was originally an online-only movie, wound up with 14 million online downloads, sold that first to CNBC, then to NBC. Now it's on ESPN and Prime. But we got to see kind of the emergence of these new organizations that came in. Many of them banded together then, and Ted Leonosis, we saw the interjection of venture capital. And venture capital is changing everything. You have to really pay attention, and especially in professional sports right now, to the role venture capital is playing. And it brought 250 sports-related websites into SB Nation, which gave us a little bit more push, and we can utilize SB Nation resources. But watching it all emerge, I think there was really a feeling early that what people were doing was replacing what you're doing. And I think that over the last several years, a large number of the individuals involved have started looking and saying, in sports and otherwise, what is our role going to be in supporting the media and making sure that we're not a competitor to the full-timers, but a complement that builds overall interest. So we are very, very active on social media. We're very, very active building our own brand. We're very, very active rebroadcasting stories. But if this whole seminar today is about the sports industry and sports business, I think that all of the individuals involved need to look and say, what role are we playing in perpetuating a healthy media environment that builds coverage, builds clicks, provides jobs for in-depth reporting, and is a net positive, not a net negative.
Well, it's funny you mentioned the role of venture capitalism, and these days, those of you who follow sports journalism, you'll notice that the Athletic has started websites in every major city around the country. It's kind of following the old ESPN model, where they were going to try to put a local ESPN site in all the major markets of the United States. They eventually abandoned that and stuck to a couple of bigger markets in the U.S. just because the expansion was going a little too fast and it wasn't making the money they'd hoped for. Nowadays, you have the Athletic, and it's kind of a cross-section of what we've just talked about, the first couple of issues. The Athletic is not doing what traditional newspapers and mainstream media have done. So they'll send reporters out to games, but they won't write game stories. They'll sit there, they'll actually watch the game, pay attention, analyze, and then they'll come back a day or so later and write a bigger issue story about it. And it's an interesting subscription-only model. They're not very heavily reliant on advertising. At least it doesn't clutter up the websites like you might see on some major mainstream newspaper sites. But it's heavily funded by venture capital. And the big debate in the industry now is whether that venture capital is going to run out at some point, and whether this model of being a heavily subscription influenced website instead of your traditional ad-based media website is actually going to work. But they are doing a lot more long-form journalism. They're doing the stuff that actually takes time to write, takes money to go out and write. I don't know if you guys are aware of what it can cost to cover sports out there. I mean, I covered baseball, like I said, 16 years. And during those 16 years, we would fly out to Mariners games and Blue Jays games. I worked for the Toronto Star beforehand. And I mean, so you're buying plane tickets, you're staying in hotels that are, halfway decent hotels. When you're on the road, you're probably averaging about $150 a night minimum in your hotel, and then you've got meals to consider. So each road trip would cost anywhere from, I don't know, $800 to $1,000, and that's each Mariners road trip. And so you add that up over the course of a season, you're looking at $20,000 just for one person covering Mariners games, and they're not necessarily going out to do all that many feature stories or investigative stories. And so people aren't aware of that cost, because now you've got all these websites that basically aggregate the content of the mainstream media that pays for that kind of stuff. And so you've got a lot of readers, especially younger ones, according to the research, that just don't want to pay for content. They'd rather read it for free, reproduce somewhere else. And they'll say, well, who cares if the Seattle Times folds, because we'll just go read our content somewhere else. But a lot of them aren't aware that you won't have that content unless somebody's out there paying for it. And so, I mean, that brings up a big issue. But right now, The Athletic is really making people think about the direction that the industry is going in, because one of their stated goals, the goals that their owners came out and stated, and they quickly try to walk it back because it got heavily criticized, was that they want to put all newspapers out of business. That's their goal. They want to take all the good reporters from newspapers and give them decent money, and in some cases they give them very good money, and just leave the newspapers dry. And I gotta say, I'm very impressed by The Athletic's content today. I read a lot of their stuff. I find it very compelling, very interesting. Part of me hopes that they survive, not so they can destroy newspapers, just so that they rekindle an interest that people have in serious content. I'm going to ask you about this a bit, Brian, because I mean, your website, one of the things they do, I mean, you're run by people that contribute for SB Nation. Some of them are paid. I believe, are they all paid, or?
Not much.
No, they don't make a whole lot of, a lot of them are devoted fans, and they really want to see basketball come back here to Seattle. Some of them want to see hockey come back, and they figure it's a means to an end of getting basketball back. And I'm sure the one trend we're seeing in the sports industry that's been ongoing for about a good 15 years now is that teams have their own websites in which they try to deliver the message to people. And I know that your website is involved more and more with people who will either be involved in the future hockey and basketball team, or who have been involved in hockey and basketball before, and they try to get messages out at times through your website. I mean, it's pretty clear when Tim Lewicki gives you guys an interview, as opposed to sitting down with Tim Lewicki's pretty good with interviews, but it's not everybody who's as big as Tim Lewicki's one of the biggest arena builders on the planet, and he's pretty much the most famous arena builder on the planet. He's sat down with your website and done interviews. You've done a lot of stuff. They're clearly trying to get a message out through you. So at what point do you feel you have to play the role less as a fan and more as an impartial journalist when you're doing those things?
I mean, as we were talking about just prior to this, I think that the job is to perpetuate and build readership and build interest and contribute value. And the hard part for the kind of newer, I'll call it pro bono forms of media, is that we are there solely at their discretion. And I think everybody in the media feels some sense of we are there at their discretion. And so I've seen it. I've talked to a lot of franchise owners. I've talked to a lot of franchise reps. I've talked to Tim and Todd and a bunch of those people continually. And I think that the idea that you're on the same team but you don't work for them is really important. And your messages are not going to resonate if you're just passing messages and narratives that the franchises want. They need the two-way interaction. I'm going to keep coming back to venture capital, because I think the concept of how media pays for itself and how it brings value and how the new world economy of sports is emerging is a really, really important one. And so if the media wants to have value, they need to generate legitimate interest. They need to build real narratives. And to do that, they need to be authentic. And you don't get authenticity if you're parroting the conversations that the media team is telling you to parrot. So you have to hear them, you have to listen to them, and you have to also be willing to challenge. And I think that you're going to find really quickly as you deal with sports executives that there is a percentage that does not want to be challenged, and there is a percentage that you are there at their discretion, and there are a percentage that place the highest value on people who are willing to move information up the chain. And I've been really lucky to be surrounded by people who place that value. And Tim, the times I've sat down with him, he's listened to me as much as I've listened to him, and that's been really valuable. I felt it's important. But you have to have a firm wall. You can't just be a mouthpiece, or you're just going to blend in and you're not going to get any interest.
Devin, we'll stick along those lines of what you're talking about is access. I mean, that's the age-old thing in journalism, in sports journalism is, when people criticize the mainstream media, the big criticism is that they don't go far enough, that they're not critical enough of the teams they cover, that they're afraid of losing the access to the locker room, the access to the people from those teams, the scoops that involve, 24-hour trade rumors, or things like that, as opposed to more serious, long-term issue stories that you can do on your own. And that's the criticism. The journalists, soft pedal it on those things, and that they don't do enough hard-hitting stuff, enough issues, really important issues, stories beyond the playing field in order to, in order to safeguard that access, that they soft pedal it for access. So I'm wondering, Devin, in your case, I mean, you're not necessarily beholden to any one sports team. You're doing stories on a whole bunch of issues. A lot of it goes way beyond the playing field. I mean, you've done issues on, I saw a story you wrote on a high school football player who died on the field or in the hospital after getting a hit on the field in Oklahoma. You've done stuff about a former U.S. Marine who got wounded, who ran a triathlon. You're looking at women in sports and sort of the issues of pay disparity. Do you ever run into access dilemmas at that point based on stuff that you've written, or are you just writing one story and are you moving on to something else? I'm wondering whether you ever feel pressure to not lose your access or anything in that way, if it's easier as a freelancer to delve around those issues.
Well, I think it's an issue I actually don't have to experience at all, because instead of, this is going to sound bad, sports journalism, we're here talking about sports journalism. In a sense, I do sports journalism, but really I tackle my stories and my coverage, whether it's in my long-form pieces for my magazine work or on social media, on Twitter. I cover politics and national affairs at the national and international level. And then I'll take a small sports angle if it's there, and I'll see if it's there without like wedging and forcing it in there. So, a couple years ago with that concussion, when high schoolers had that epidemic around the country where there's a sharp rise 3 or 4 years ago in high schoolers dying of concussions. I did that story. But, I did a Me Too story 3 years before Me Too happened with Shannon Zabados, who was the Team Canada women's goalie for the past 3 Olympics, and she's won gold every time. But before this current season, she spent her entire pro, college, and junior hockey career playing in men's leagues, and the sexism and abuse that she received. So, and right now I'm starting a story about the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas shooting for the 1-year anniversary. 4 months from yesterday will be 1 year. So I really don't experience that because I look for major political or national current event issues and topics going on, and then if there's a sports angle, I'll throw it in there. If it's not, it's not in there. And then if I'm reaching out to a team, I really don't focus on teams. So more like individuals in the private sector. So like the Marine story you're talking about, that was a story for The Atlantic last year about military suicide. And I profiled a Marine who for 10 years, now a former Marine, for 10 years tried to kill himself repeatedly. And we talked about his addiction to alcohol and his PTSD and his mental health issues. and how he literally tried to kill himself. He would tell me in-depth details about the attempts and who was there and who knew and whatnot.
So you're going into real journalism. You're not beholden to a
No,
team vice president to get
don't
these
really
stories.
talk-
Clearly.
Last time I talked with the team was probably for the Shannon Zabadov's story, but before that was ages ago, back when I was at ESPN. Even when I'm at Sports Illustrated, when I was at Sports Illustrated for a couple of years, I don't deal with teams. I don't deal with athletes normally. So it's a wonderful thing that I don't have to worry about.
See, when I talk to some younger beat writers, this is what I try to tell them. Sometimes you should stay away from the stories that are inside the locker room and try to go beyond that, and don't be so beholden to coaches. And you know what, it's easier said than done. It's a really tough job being a professional beat writer. The ones who are doing it right now, I'm not going to sit here and pretend, oh, I did it better than you all those years, because it was tough and it's a grueling grind. And you do have to fall back on the teams at times, but sometimes some people can stand to be a little more independent. I think that's my opinion.
I'll throw this out, Jeff.
Yeah.
I think that a cold call to media people is really more effective than people think. There tends to be a pedestal applied to professional sports franchises, and it's perpetuated by the kind of barrier that they put around themselves. There's definitely a feeling like you're in the industry or you're out. And if you're out, you shouldn't cross that line. And if you authoritatively call and request access, you sometimes get it. And I think that people should not be afraid to cross that barrier respectfully. And what I've seen is that overall, the job of the media members, it was interesting to listen to the last presentation that just went on here, talking about how television media money is so much bigger than everything else, that ticket sales and on-field and all that stuff, they kind of have trouble justifying their own existence almost, because they can be really successful at what they do, and it's just a small bit compared to that television revenue. But it's so necessary. If all you had was that, if you lost all the other things, they wouldn't have the television revenue. So I generally find that if I call, and I've received access to the Mariners, Seahawks, Sounders, and Sonics, and now the NHL, I generally find if you call and you say, I would like to cover your team, this is what I would like to do, this is where I can bring value or interest or perspective or whatever it is, the people are excited to try to facilitate you. And especially looking for youth and new coverage and people who aren't going to be as salty as my friend Jeff Baker, they're more welcoming than you would expect.
Let me just bounce back to you for a second, Devin, because you did write that story about that high school player who died in Oklahoma, and head injuries has obviously become a big part of the entire football discussion. But when you worked back at ESPN, there was a little controversy going on internally there about whether or not to air a documentary that was about head injuries and concussions. Tell us a bit about that, because I find that interesting, because I have a feeling you could probably get away with writing a story like that or doing a documentary like that right now in your current role as a contributor to somebody like, let's say, The Atlantic versus ESPN, who, Brian was just mentioning the television money, and I mean, ESPN's got a multi-billion-dollar deal with the NFL and with college football as well, the whole college football playoff system. And so tell us a bit about how that influenced a bit of the coverage that went on back when you were there.
Oh man, it was, and I have friends that are still there in Bristol. I lived in Bristol. There's literally one campus for ESPN and a gas station and nothing else in Bristol. I loved it though. Loved ESPN, but it's something that, especially under the new leadership at ESPN, Jimmy Pitaro, I've heard from friends and other people that work at ESPN that it's a tightrope that you have to walk, because you have these huge media contracts with leagues to get rights to the games, and then throw in the highlights that are highlights rights that are in those negotiations as well. And if you piss off the league with a hard-hitting investigative story from like Dan Van Natta, or Outside the Lines, my boss at ESPN was the senior producer for Outside the Lines, so we'd have those conversations. If you piss them off enough, they're going to be like, well, Fox is offering maybe a little bit less or maybe a little bit more, I don't care. We'll go there. Because they'll run fluff pieces on us. So you have to find when I was at ESPN, you know, we were constantly, as an organization, you know, there's the entertainment unit, and then the news unit. We've got to try and make everybody happy internally and then externally with partners and leagues.
I don't want to just pick on ESPN with this, and full disclosure, I mean, at the Seattle Times, we have partnerships with the various sports teams as well. If you look at our a big part of our news coverage over the last 2 years, I would say, has involved what we would call labs. So we have our transportation lab, our homeless lab, education lab, and what those labs are is we take a group of reporters and we devote them full-time to all the issues involving transportation, education, and homelessness. And they produce these really compelling stories. Some of them are daily pieces, some of them are a lot longer think pieces, and they get great reader response. They're really an important part of our news coverage, and I think it's one of the better things we've added at the Seattle Times over the last few years. But if you read the fine print in some of these things, you'll see who is paying for all this stuff, because somebody's got to pay for it. We can't just pull reporters off their beats and say, all right, you're just going to focus on this one area, unless we're getting some big money to hire more reporters, to pay people to aggregate this stuff for us, this content. And so you look at the fine print, you know, and one of them, the Seattle Mariners, are paying for X amount of money. You've got the Rakes Foundation with our homelessness lab, and Jeff Rakes is a Mariners owner. You know, I can go on and on. You've got some of the bigger Seattle businesses, people in non-sports communities that are paying for this stuff. But I'm sticking to the sports angle right now because, you know, look, we write stories that are critical of the Mariners all the time. I know I do. And, you know, anybody who's familiar with my work, you'll know that some of my stories have not been too flattering to the Mariners over the years. And, you know, that can be an issue at times. I will say, and I'm very pleased that I've never had interference from above on any story I've written for the paper, but I know there are discussions that go on ahead of time. I know that they do have to alert the owner of the paper because, you know, he has a right to know that, hey, this big money you're expecting right now from the team, it could be put in a little bit of jeopardy because we're about to run a front page expose on somebody from the Seattle Mariners, and they might not want to give us more money to do other stuff after this. So that's, you know, that's professional courtesy to tell your newspaper's owner that this is going on. In fairness, I have never had the newspaper's owner come back and say, you can't run that story. But as we move more towards this model, where you are going to have outside businesses supplementing the newspaper coverage, I mean, these are issues that could come into play. You know, I already know somebody that pulled out of one of these labs because of an unflattering front page article that we did, not on a sports person, this was on a business within the city. And this person was implicated indirectly in the story, and he ended up pulling some of his sponsorship of our stuff. So it's on a very micro scale compared to what's going on at ESPN with billion-dollar football deals, but I mean, it is something that comes into play on a daily basis, which is what you were mentioning, just about how money is influencing journalistic coverage.
I think money is the story. You're talking about journalism, and you know, if you think you're nervous about access going to a team manager, ESPN is more nervous going to the networks. As big as they are, the other guys are bigger. They're what's funding everything. And so again, as people who value the sports industry and value the storylines coming to the narratives, figuring out ways to have a new economic model emerge. And young people who are attending conferences like these are going to figure out, is this going to drive towards subscription services like The Atlantic? 5 years ago, that was unheard of. Nobody wanted to sign up. And now because you can do one-click enrollment, people are becoming more used to subscription services. There's a new trend to say, well, maybe we can fund it all through subscriptions. Or is it going to come through ad clicks the way SB Nation does, which is frankly horrendous, and I hope it ends and they find, or are they going to do what you're talking about at the Seattle Times, and it is going to influence everything that everybody does, and it's the big question is, what is the next funding model for the media going to be, and how is venture capitalism going to affect it?
Well, let me jump in, and this is sort of a side topic, but we only have limited time here, and I wanted to cover this at one point. How much do you think social media is influencing what the media covers these days? Because you know, we hear it in the media all the time. Hey, you've got to be active on social media. It's a great way to market yourself. You can use it for crowdsourcing to go see what people are reading. I do that all the time. I read various websites. I read Brian's website. You know, not because I think these people that are commenting on it, I read the comment sites a lot, probably too much sometimes. But I want to find out what people are saying out in public, not because I necessarily think they're right, but I want to hear what they're talking about, and I'm thinking, boy, is this something I should address? Should I actually, sometimes I don't think what they're talking about makes a whole lot of sense, but I realize if they're talking about it, maybe somebody should set them straight and say, go interview some people and find out what the real story is. So I do that all the time, but I'm wondering if we pay too much attention in the media to this kind of stuff, to where you get people that will try to tailor their stories sometimes to appease the masses and get a bigger Twitter following. Do you ever feel that pressure? I mean, because I know what I can write. If I want to get 50,000 Twitter followers, I know exactly what I want to write and what they want me to write, and I'll tell them exactly what they want to hear. But I don't know. I don't succumb to that. But it's not an easy thing to do sometimes. Have you ever run across that as a?
Well, I know exactly what you mean. You know, covering the White House and what's going on in Washington D.C. right now is my main use of Twitter, and also good source of story ideas for the long term for me. So, you know, if I wanted to, you know, I don't have, because I'm not a full-time staffer somewhere, I don't have that massive Twitter following like you do or Sonics Rising does. But I have a solid base, and, you know, quality over quantity. You know, if you have good people that follow you and they can amplify you, it helps as much or more than having the right amount of followers. I wish I had more followers, but hey, what happens? But if I wanted to, I could, you know, especially covering politics on a day-to-day basis, I could write about Trump one way or the other, or cover whatever his latest tweet is or scandal is one way or the other. And if I wasn't going down the line narrow, I could grow. I could also probably avoid getting death threats. I got one via Twitter a week before the 2016 election for something I was doing. You know, I get harassed on social media a lot. So, like, again, I've said this about something else on this topic or discussion already. It's a tightrope. You know, you can use it to self-promote and blow yourself up and become the next social viral star, or especially in journalism, you can play the long game and slowly grow your follows, you know, or just your readership in general, and do it the right way. But it comes at a cost if you do it the right way, because it's slower, it's more stressful. I worry about my numbers. I check my Twitter analytics. I was just, I think, on it last night. Or, you know, you just are putting yourself out there for harassment, death threats, stuff like that.
I never get harassed on Twitter.
You never lay one out there.
No, never.
Controversy.
Never. And I'm glad you brought this up, because I was kind of setting this whole thing up because I wanted to talk to Brian about this. So we've had this arena situation here in Seattle going on forever, and now we're finally we finally have resolved it, because Key Arena is going to be renovated for $750 million. That's the last figure that's been floated out there, give or take 50 million. And there's going to be an NHL team that comes as of December. It's going to be announced in December in Georgia, and then they'll have NHL coming here by either 2020 or 2021. But this has been a long and acrimonious debate at times amongst Seattle sports fans about whether we should put the Key Arena, whether we should be doing Key Arena at all, whether we should have picked a project in the Soto district. I'm not gonna pump either one of those projects up right now. I mean, the purpose of this discussion, I wanted to ask you, Brian, whether you feel social media helped at all in informing people about this debate, or whether it might have poisoned the water a little bit when it comes to this debate. And you know, we can get into everything. We can talk about the media's role in it. We can talk about. But it reminds me a lot of the election. I'm going to keep talking here, even though I asked you the question. I mean, it reminds me a lot of what went on in the last election. We have people, I'm talking about federally, we have people talking about how now, you know, there's this polarization in America. People only want to hear what they want to hear from the media, and the media played some role in that. And I'm just wondering whether you feel there's room for discourse, or whether you think the discourse kind of got sidetracked.
I think that if you want to consider yourself a journalist and a member of the media, then you have to be able to create discourse. The broader public struggles mightily creating discourse on Twitter and social media, but whether you're writing for a blog or writing for the Seattle Times, the New York Times, leadership means that you should lead discussions. To pull back a second what you were talking about earlier and kind of related, but Todd Lewicki, who is the guy I just follow now, everything he says, you read it because it's valuable, said to The Athletic about 2 weeks ago that successful sports franchises, they work for the fans, and they live through the fans, and they follow the fans, and what he said is, you buy tickets where the fans buy tickets, you sit in the seats with the fans, you eat the hot dogs with the fans. And I think that social media participation for what you're talking about, for sensing the general mood, for viewing what are the discussions, because if 20 people are commenting on social media, you can bet 2,000 people are thinking about it somewhere. It is a good form of eating the hot dogs. It's a good form of putting yourself out there and feeling the fans, and it's what every franchise desperately needs. So if you're trying to go work for a franchise and that franchise wants to maintain authenticity, wants to be close to their audience, they got to go out there and dip their feet in the social media cesspool once in a while. But does it turn dark? Absolutely. Is it a risk? The reason a lot of franchises are so careful about it is because they're terrified where it might go. And the arena battle is a really good example of that. I think Chris Hansen had a really good following going on for a long time that wound up being overtaken by a negative social media presence because of a lack of control. So just to kind of, I think absolutely it's incumbent upon people who want to lead the discussion to lead it in a productive manner, but there's a reason that professional sports franchises are terrified of being directly affiliated with the conversations that occur because they can get out of line really quickly.
What happened in Seattle, I mean, a lot of the conversations ended up devolving to the point where people would be accused of corruption, left, right, and center. I mean, Brian's been accused of it. I've been accused of it. Politicians in Seattle have been accused of it. And you know, I'm always up for accusing a politician of corruption when they deserve it. But, I mean, you're talking about people who are just getting, you know, tarred with the same brush, saying, oh, well, you know somebody who works for this person who knows the Port of Seattle, hence you're all corrupt. And that's what it kind of devolved into in social media. And to the point where I don't think it's completely, I know your website spent a lot of time fighting with that internally, trying to, trying to be respectful to the people who have been there with you for a long time, commenting on site, and finally just saying, like, enough's enough, we got to stop.
Yeah, I think you'd move on. And we went to war with the Seattle Mariners. I'm one of the people in the room who say I've been at war with a professional sports franchise. We declared Twitter war and actually used social media to press an advantage where we were trending on 7 different categories and had leaders of a multi-billion-dollar organization directly engaging with us. And again, that's the beauty of it. And that's something that can only really happen in sports. Sports, I always say, has a louder microphone than it probably deserves. It's amazing that you take this one part of our society, and we've got no less than 5 local news stations, probably 20 different beat reporters, hundreds of thousands of Twitter followers, all the different things, and it's all around sports. And you know, transit and homelessness and all these other issues don't necessarily have that. So with a louder voice, you get louder echoes, you get bigger mistakes, and I think anyone coming into journalism or into sports has to be aware that every little thing you do has the ability to get amplified in that big echo chamber that is sports. And I think that's what happened with our issue. I on one hand was very proud of having built the volume on that, and on the other was very disappointed with where it went. And again, as someone who entered this with aspirations of being professional and a journalist, it was disappointing that it wound up in many cases not being that way, but I think that's what people need to be on the defense for.
Have any of you heard anything here that you wanted to ask us about? Lunch isn't going to start for 15 minutes. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. I mean, these are serious. I mean, for us in the industry, these are very serious topics, and they aren't necessarily for the average fan. I mean, what Brian just said really makes a lot of sense. We don't devote coverage. We don't pick a business in the city and say, all right, we're going to go put this person on them for 165 days a year and just follow them around everywhere we go. And if they get on a plane, we're going on a plane. We do that to a small extent, and we do that to an extent with politics, but it's not to the same degree. You know, we cover the Seattle Mariners 162 games a year at the Seattle Times. And what that means is we give them automatic free publicity in the newspaper. You know, they could take out an ad and pay a fortune to have a half-page, full-page ad every day, but we give it to them for free by covering their games. We don't do that to any other business in this city, and every other newspaper does relatively the same thing. It's a crazy world that we live in sports, and I can tell you, having lived the world of Major League Baseball for many, many years, it's not a world anybody outside of it would ever understand. Like the players you hear about that are ego-free, they're great, you know, civilians, whatever, they're the most egocentric people you've ever met. I guarantee you, their egos would be twice the size. And those are the good guys. You know, some of the bad guys, they just exist on a different plane than you. They've been groomed from the time they were 12 to just think they're the greatest and everybody else is there to serve them. And that goes on. It's not a bad movie plot. That's the reality. And then you deal with the people who run those people, the people who control their lives, the billionaires out there. And some of them are very nice, some of them are very engaging people, like he just mentioned, like Brian just mentioned, like Todd Lewicki, who's a man who's very respected here in Seattle by, I think, the media in general and the general public across all sports. But then you got people that are not so nice, you know, working in other parts. So we try to navigate them, and there's a lot of pressures now internally just with the finances that are impacting the industry to do good storytelling, to do stuff like Devin does, stuff that actually matters. You know, honestly, nobody's going to care that the Seahawks won this game in London yesterday. A couple of weeks from now, and a few years from now, nobody's even going to remember it took place, except for a few people in Britain. But you know, stuff that you write about, Devin, I mean, that kind of stuff can matter because it is life and death at times.
Yeah, like last night I was going back to the social media. Actually, it's a great way to get sources, especially for stories like I do. I'm not relying on teams and their PR departments. I'm, you know, reaching out to everyday average people. Last night or over the weekend, I reached out. I got information on some people that were impacted by a department shooting at Stoneman Douglas, and Cole reached out via Facebook Messenger, and a random friend request that I sent to a widow of one of the school administrators. And she messaged me back out of the blue and said, yeah, I want to talk. So she called me at 6 o'clock our time, 9 o'clock out there, and last night, and I was having dinner and put the fork down, and we talked. And it's completely lost where I was going to go.
No, you were talking about getting sources.
Yeah, getting
social
sources.
media.
So yeah, social media is, I apologize, it's huge. Whether you can get info on people from a sports PR department, or you know, you can track their political affiliations and their voter registration info, and you can find them on LinkedIn or whatnot. But you know, most of my stories, I've been lucky enough to find people via Twitter or Facebook, as well as the regular email, their house phone, their cell phone, their voter registration, etc. But I have that success of cold reaching out to people more times than not. Facebook, and I hate Facebook. I only use it for journalism, and I play Words with Friends with my mom.
A very quick word of advice from somebody who investigates people for a living: like, don't ever write anything stupid on Facebook. If you can help, and if you're trying to get away with something, don't do the exact opposite on Facebook and then post it for everybody to see, because that's the first place somebody like me, and you would be surprised at how many times we literally bust people because they lie to us, and then they go and you find out, oh, okay, you weren't really here, you were off partying in Hawaii at the time that you said you didn't take your investors' money, and go, yeah, but here we have a picture of you standing at a luau in Waikiki, yeah. And it's amazing. It's like America's dumbest criminals all tend to congregate on Facebook and just brag about it for the world. So don't, if you're ever trying to get away with something, don't post it on Facebook, because that happens. All right, enough of me talking. Somebody has a question here. I know that. Sure.
I do have one question.
Yeah.
My name's Sharon Perry. I'm from the East Coast.
Whereabouts?
Rhode Island, so about an hour from Boston.
Yeah, I know where it is.
Yeah. And I'm over, it's hard to familiar. But there's a lot of like barstool sports going on, and that's a
Oh.
huge thing, and I'm very not for that, just to get that out there in the open. And that sort of thing is, there's also just the kind of Boston scene in general, a lot of people kind of, it's easy to aggravate the Bostonian crowd. And I kind of think of it on social media as, Barstool does a lot of things that people don't like, but they also do a lot of things that are really engaging on social media. And as I may be saying, that journalists with integrity is maybe going too far, but someone who doesn't want to go to that level, but still wants to engage people through social media, how do you guys look at that, and do you do anything like that?
Well, what Barstool's been doing is what's been going on for over 100 years in the newspaper industry, except it's tabloid newspapers that do it, and they used to put pictures of scantily clad women either on, page 2, page 3, and people would say, why did you do that? And the answer is because people buy it. And this is back before they put pornography on the internet, but back in those days, yeah, if you want a picture of a woman in a bikini, just buy the newspaper, there she is on page. That's what some of the bad tabloids would do. Barstool's taking that to another extreme, and they will, they'll just have a bunch of guys on there, and they'll have podcasts too, in which they just belittle women, and they'll say all kinds of stuff that sounds cool if you're a frat boy who's had a few too many, and you're 19 or something, but probably isn't that cool in a professional setting, and there's a whole bunch of controversy about that. And what happens is when you criticize Barstool, kind of like what I'm doing now, what they'll do is if any of you tweet out, hey, this guy just criticized Barstool, Barstool will actually, they'll sick their followers on you. And by the hundreds, by the thousands, they'll harass you to the point of you'll have to change your phone number, you'll have to move to a new address, you'll have to get police to maybe circle your house a few times. I mean, it's not just Barstool that's doing it. You've seen it happen with the whole Gamergate controversy, where there was like a lawyer who was actually threatening, physically threatening people, and people who were being stalked for criticizing stuff that was going on in the gamer industry. So I mean, this type of harassment, what we do to discourage it. You asked what we do to discourage this on social media.
My idea is kind of like they use a lot of video techniques, and that's primarily on social media like Twitter, Facebook, whatever. I think that's kind of a trend that our generation, my generation, is specifically going towards, creating engaging content in that way, but not doing it in like an inappropriate way. So like I obviously with more traditional newspaper stuff, that's not something you guys maybe are used to doing, but are there ways you try to incorporate that sort of thing?
Totally. I'll jump off, sorry.
No, go for it.
Especially with Twitter, whether it's a video, a GIF, or an image, a photo, whatever, that kind of a tweet is going to get so much more engagement, whether it's retweets, favorites, likes, whatever it's called, comments, maybe even direct follows to your account. You're going to get so much more engagement by putting something visually relevant with your tweet, as opposed to just having a random whatever that same tweet is, but without the visual image. So if I'm tweeting about the past few weeks, done a lot of outside of my long form work, the day-to-day work covering Kavanaugh, Supreme Court stuff. If I have a picture of Kavanaugh, whether it's a Getty Images picture of him, or if I'm covering the Senate vote, and I have a picture of the Senate literally voting right then, obviously attributed to however I got it, I'm going to get more engagement than I'm going to have that same exact information, that tweet, without anything in there.
We actually, sorry.
I think that what you're asking though is what is building engagement, what is being controversial for the sake of clickbait. And as Jeff said, anything you put on Facebook is going to live with you for a long time. Sports is a crazy, crazy world. I once got into a bar fight with Nick Van Exel. Did it for real.
You should have started that off.
Yeah, no, I could have.
Everybody.
And I have been in some really crazy, insane situations with professional athletes. And I think that you have to decide what you want for your career and what you want for your reputation. And more, we are seeing that everything follows you, and that societal norms change, and that inappropriate behavior has consequences. So you have to decide what you want to build. And we are constantly faced with the decision on, is this controversial, is this engaging positively or is this engaging negatively? And I would just tell you, better be safe rather than sorry, because you're going to enter a field where there's plenty of opportunity for controversy, where people will remember that you told them about them, and they will tell the stories about you. And I would just advise you that if you have any moral questions on whether something is appropriate or inappropriate, decide that it's inappropriate, because you have you'll get future opportunities that you don't want to burn.
We actually have policies about that now at the Seattle Times but first of all, we are encouraged to put photos with everything that we do on Twitter, because it does get more engagement. We just did a video of the arena, the new practice facility the NHL team's building out at Northgate Mall. We had our video people create a Twitter, basically embed the video of the place into Twitter, and our engagement just went off the charts with our posts with that, because it looked really cool. But we also have policies in place where we can't put up anything that's even going to be remotely deemed as sexist, or anything that encourages bullying of somebody else or demeaning other people. That's a very tricky one when it comes to Twitter, because everybody knows Twitter exists on snark. And you have a lot of reporters out there, and I'm guilty of it at times too, who can get very snarky on Twitter. But it's actually against our Twitter policies. It violates our rules. You can actually get suspended at our place for that. You can get fired for it if you do it too many times, or if you do one really egregious one, you could get fired for it. So that's been changing a lot. That's changed tenfold from the time when I first started tweeting back in 2009 or whatever it was, 2010. People have caught up now, and because we're a lot more aware of cyberbullying and stuff, which is what Barstool Sports does. And so, yeah, we can't do anything even remotely close to that. I think the Seattle Times is probably a little more politically correct than some places, just because of the environment Seattle is. It's a very progressive city compared to other places. And so we're very limited in how far we can stretch that.
If you cross the line, you're out with these guys.
Yeah, my question was more towards what you kind of just referenced with the whole community video and that sort of thing. Nothing.
Yeah, no.
just things I wouldn't
We
engage
actually
before,
employ staffs now that do this for us. Back in the day, they used to make us do this, and it would take a lot of our time up. Now we actually have people who sit there, online producers, and who will throw a quick video together and embed it for us in our tweets, on our Facebook posts. And it really, really does drive up the engagement.
5 to 10 times the volume.
Oh,
for
it's-
us if you have a visual.
It's amazing. Anybody else? I saw you in the back. You had a question. Yeah, you?
Oh, yeah, so I just had a quick question, actually. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on names, I'm awful with names, really go with bases, yes.
Devin.
So you said you came out of college and worked for ESPN. How did you go about making that connection? Was it through like an internship that you did, or just connections?
Yeah, so Northeast roots. I went to Syracuse in New York, and I got 2 degrees, one in broadcast journalism. Even though I'm a writer now. Sorry, Mom. And then I got a 2nd degree in sport business. And to graduate from the sport business program at Syracuse, you have a full-time 540-hour internship you have to do in your senior year. It takes up 1 semester. It's literally the only thing you're pretty much allowed to do. So I interned with NBC Sports between their Stamford, Connecticut office and 30 Rock in New York before they moved everything for NBC Sports up to Stamford. And then I lucked out when I got to ESPN because I think I wouldn't have gotten ESPN if I didn't have NBC on my resume. But I actually was applying for a scheduling acquisition, TV scheduling rights and acquisition job on the business side. Getting those contract deals with the NBA, MLB, whatever, and slotting in game X on a Tuesday night at 8 o'clock, and are we going to put SportsCenter before it or after it, whatever. I was like a finalist for that job, and I didn't get it. But the hiring manager looked at my resume and was like, you're better suited to actually be a journalist, or to be in production. Hand my stuff over to there, and one of the execs from SportsCenter called me out of the blue and said, I'm going to give you a test, and if I like it, I'll interview you for a job. And I lucked out extremely, extremely lucky. And then I moved to Bristol.
That's great.
ESPN.com does have Seattle offices.
Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, that's time.
head it off.
All right, well, hey, thanks for coming,
You
guys.
guys want to stay and chat with them? You're more than
Appreciate it.
welcome.
Plus, don't forget, we got free DVDs here of Sonicsgate, any award-winning documentary on the Sonics and their untimely departure from Seattle. Thank you, guys.
I decided. Makes sense. Really? I thought he was gonna go to LA.